the Radical Secular Podcast, a demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, insights, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Welcome to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Sean Prophet.
I'm Drew Scott.
And I'm Joe Okipinti.
Today we're going to talk about the liberal media's both sides problem. And in the process, we'll delve more deeply into why we at the Radical Secular call ourselves post-liberal, an adjective that places all of us firmly at odds with much of the liberal consensus. We've all heard that famous quote from Elie Wiesel that neutrality favors the oppressor. And today we're going to discuss how the supposedly fact-based liberal media ends up routinely and powerfully legitimizing right-wing talking points that should never see the light of day. Christophe will be joining us today for this discussion in our guest segment, along with the host of the Secular Left podcast, Doug Berger. In our news segment, we'll talk about last week's California special recall election results, Unhinged Joe Biden conspiracy theories, the upcoming release of Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's new book, Peril, ongoing Florida craziness, social justice at the Met Gala, and we'll hear a brief climate update from Joe. But first, I want to remind you to make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends to listen. And please head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/theradicalsecular. We'd really appreciate your support, even if it's just buying us a cup of coffee every month. We have support tiers from $3 a month on up. And new episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. Now this week I want to give a shout out to our new Patreon supporter Carrie Johnson from Minnesota, who's supporting the show at a $9 a month tier. Carrie's someone I've known most of my life and who certainly recognizes the importance of secularism and social justice. So welcome to our Patreon team, Carrie. I'm really glad to have your support.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Yeah, now let's get into our t-shirts. Drew and Joe, what do you got? Joe, why don't you go first?
So, speaking of post-liberalism, I think one of the ways we need to redefine this idea of what liberal means is to really ground ourselves in science more, right? So this is what I got, right?
Because science. Oh, you're winking out. Okay, I think we saw it though. Because science.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of things we can talk about, and we will talk about over the course of this episode and many others, I think, on what it means to be post-liberal. And I think we really do need to critically redefine who we are and what we stand for and what our philosophy is. Right?
Yeah, there's a lot of anti-science garbage on the left. I hate to say it.
There is. Yeah.
Definitely.
So, Drew, what do you got for a shirt?
Well, I knew the theme of the show largely was going to be media, so I know you guys know I usually sport some sort of mashup. This one is from a hardcore band that I really like called the Dillinger Escape Plan, and they did a limited run of these shirts that say the Billinger Escape Plan, and it's got Bill O'Reilly from that infamous YouTube clip where he's spazzing out about the teleprompter, and at the bottom it's hard to read this low, but it says "fucking guy sucks" at the bottom.
Yeah, that fucking guy does suck. I'm so glad we don't hear much from him anymore.
Bill O'Reilly. Yeah, it's a blast from the past.
I hear him on satellite radio sometimes doing home title lock ads. So never give that company your money.
No, and you know, I mean, I'm not sure if I think Sean Hannity is worse, who took his slot. So yeah, I mean, it's just a parade of these guys.
Yeah, for sure.
And you had something else to show us, right?
I did have something else. So I recently invested in a 3D printer, and it took me a little while to get it up and running properly. And, you know, we're all big Star Trek fans here at the Radical Secular. And I tell you, this thing is about as close as you're going to get to a replicator. Look at this.
You made that with your 3D printer? Wow.
I printed that with my 3D printer.
That's awesome.
I sanded it down and then painted it, and you know, it's a prop for my toy photography. It's a 1/12 scale Tyrannosaurus skull.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
How big is it? Like 6 inches or so? 12 inches?
Bigger than, I mean, that's not 12 inches. I'd say maybe 7 or 8 inches long. It's pretty big.
Nice.
About as big as your head.
You must have a pretty good size 3D printer there to do that.
It's actually on the lower end. The model is the Elegoo Neptune 2. It was only like $180 on Amazon.
Oh, wow.
I thought that these machines were a lot more expensive, but it's actually pretty cheap to jump into it. It's pretty awesome.
It's just like inkjet printers, though. They get you on the filament on those 3D printers.
Right.
Yeah. The filament is, it's like $20 a spool, and the spool lasts a good amount of time. But yeah, it's not free.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, that is super cool, Drew. I can't wait to see what else you come up with.
Yeah, the last time I looked into like 3D printers, they were like $1,000 and up. Now they're like 200 and under. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Technology is just wow.
Yeah, well, I'm striving for a show record for the most obscure Star Trek reference, and my shirt is Ming the Merciless. Okay.
Oh, that's pretty awesome.
Ming the Merciless is a character he's the villain in the Flash Gordon series. He was the blueprint for the Dr. Chaotica character in the Adventures of Captain Proton holodeck program on Voyager. Okay, so that's pretty obscure, isn't it?
Tom Paris, right?
Yeah, Tom Paris and Harry Kim.
Yeah, Harry Kim.
But it's super awesome, not awesome, that the Janeway character had to pretend to fall in love with Chaotica in the Bride of Chaotica episode, and I will never forget her eye roll to camera in that one.
I totally get that. I remember that scene.
They broke the fourth wall there a little bit. I don't know if that was a wall, but anyway, okay, let's talk about the news. The first thing, obviously, that's on everyone's mind is the California recall election results. And Drew, since you're in California, you want to start? What's the general feeling in California right now?
Overwhelming relief. I mean, a few weeks ago, the result was not so certain. The polling was looking not that great for Newsom. It seemed like there was a chance that he might dip below the 50% threshold and that we might actually have to go through with this recall nonsense. It wasn't until a couple days before the election that the poll numbers started improving and started getting in the mid 60s or so. And by the time that, the election came around, I was pretty calm about it. Still had some nervous feelings about it, but man, still the relief flooded into my veins because Larry Elder is a fucking psycho. And if you live in this state and supported that stupid recall, you need to rethink your goddamn life. I mean, really.
I know. Unfortunately, like he got trounced, shellacked, what you come up with your whatever term you want. He got destroyed. And it was a resounding repudiation of Trumpism and also of COVID resistance, which I thought was great. And I was worried too, because whatever the polls say, everything is turnout. And so, who was going to return those ballots, and were they going to, was California going to go Republican based on, people throwing away their junk mail or whatever,
I think the last time was kind of an anomaly because people enjoyed the novelty of being able to vote for Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think you're like, oh, I can vote for the Terminator. Hell yeah. And
and he didn't end up being like if he was on the ballot, like it wouldn't be that bad. Like, he would be at least sane, right?
Yeah, he's a centrist.
Yeah.
Yes.
But, I was going to say if you look at the map, the areas of the state that are most impacted by COVID were also the ones to vote in favor of the recall. Okay. And that's just insane. We're seeing it's a whole like red counties in California where people are dying at high rates and they're still voting to end the COVID restrictions.
It's funny. California is a lot like Massachusetts, where the Republican Party is just like Massachusetts is overwhelmingly Democratic, like California is, but the Republican Party is so off the wall now in the state. Like they're just so extremist. And like they're just killing them. They're just destroying their chances of actually gaining power in the state, like they are in California.
Yeah, well, and they also they knew they were going to lose because they already had a website ready to go claiming election fraud. And I think when it came out, the results came out like pretty close to 2-1. I think they kind of gave up on that idea, and Elder conceded within like hours of the polls closing. So that was kind of awesome.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Drew.
Oh, sorry, just real quick. I was just going to say, I think Dan Savage once said that there aren't red and blue states. There are only red states with blue cities big enough to flip them. Fortunately, we have some sizable blue cities here in this state. So it turned the right way.
Very much so. And I want to talk a little bit about the recall reform that's been proposed here. And this recall process, it pretends to be this populist thing, but it's really a minority power grab. And the GOP, like you said, Joe, knows that its goose is cooked probably permanently in places like California, Massachusetts. So it's relegated to minority power grabs like recall elections. And they know that the recall can result in someone who gets a tiny share of the vote, like maybe even 20% becoming governor, the way that it's structured. And also, these things are rare, and it seems like almost maybe they were trying to do a trial run for doing this again other places, because this was only the fourth gubernatorial recall election in U.S. history. And, you know, 3 of them were this century. And only one other time in 1921, 100 years ago, North Dakota, a governor was recalled. But that's it. In the history of America, only 4 recalls, and 2 of them have failed. So I just want to talk briefly about what they're planning to do, which is to raise the threshold for the recall up to 25% of the number of people who voted in the last election, and also requiring that the recall be for cause, like some kind of criminal or unethical behavior, as opposed to just, we don't like him. And
or he had the audacity of winning.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Also raising the filing fee, tightening signature requirements, allowing the sitting governor to be added to the list of replacement candidates, which only makes sense, because having it's just so weird, because you get like 40 people on the ballot. So to win a plurality of an election where there's 40 people running, you know, you could technically get only like 6% if nobody else got higher than that, right?
Right.
So the other thing that they're talking about doing is amending the recall process so that if the governor is recalled, the lieutenant governor automatically assumes office. And that way you're not having this circus.
What I'm seeing here is I'm looking at the vote count, and it was higher than expected for Newsom, right? And it was similar actually to the votes he got in the general governor's election, about 7.7 million or so. And it beat most of the polls, right? Most of the polls were a little bit lower than that. I think that's really interesting, that when it really comes down to it, the voters turned out again. And that's really encouraging. I also think that the other thing I see is that Trump is really becoming a destructive force with no bounds, including his own efforts, right, in his own party. I mean, he's suppressing the GOP vote at this point, which is great. Let's have more of that. I mean, but the GOP is just going along with it because they are so stuck in this reality of theirs at this point, where they see Trump as this powerful figure that's governing their whole party. The other thing I think that's really interesting is how Newsom's stance on the pandemic ultimately helped him. I mean, it looked like it was hurting him for a while, but it really turned out that it was helping him. And I think the Delta variant surge really woke up a lot of people. And California has a particularly high vaccination rate compared to most states. And certainly compared to, I mean, if you compare it to Texas, right? Texas is doing far worse in many ways in terms of its outcomes. And the other thing is voters in California support a mandate, and that's what Newsom was all about. So this, I think, also puts Newsom back as a potential national figure and a presidential candidate.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's also, if you look at the scatter plot in California of the number of hospitalizations versus vaccinations, and you go at the very top is like San Francisco and some of those counties up there, and then at the very bottom you've got some of the heavily red counties, and it's just a straight line. I mean, it's very the clustering is yeah.
Yeah, I mean the vaccines are incredibly efficacious. We know this, and the data supports it, and it's just a matter of getting the message out as much as we can with all the resistance there is to try to get the message out.
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on now to some of the national politics, which is what we're hearing a lot now ramping up is these unhinged Joe Biden conspiracy theories. And I'm just going to read them off. They're so preposterous. It reminds me so much of Obama, the Obama presidency, and the way the Republicans just lost their shit. And so people are actually seriously saying on the right now that someone other than Biden is controlling policy and calling the shots. And some people think it's President Obama. And they also say that someone other than Biden is determining who gets called on in the White House press room. They also think that that Biden is having his mic cut off by someone during press junkets. And this has been said repeatedly, like 4 times in a Senate hearing by another old white guy, Senator James E. Risch from Idaho. Okay. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was visibly amused at the question on this clip that I saw. But the claim itself is just preposterous. I mean, and he repeated it 4 times. It's like, the next one, of course, is that Biden is senile and getting worse. They've been saying that since before even the campaign. But, these outlandish claims, they barely require comment. My only comment would be to compare this, to what happened under Obama. And it's the same playbook. Obama was black, Biden is old. And you can draw your own conclusions as to why Republicans won't stick to the issues.
Right. What I wonder is where the limits of this absurdity lie, right? Because this really is absurd, right? The GOP has been thriving on this craziness, and it works for them, right? It works for their base, and it works for some people in the middle as well, unfortunately. And it keeps people wholly distracted from the true causes of their misery, right? Or the true issues that we really need to deal with. It creates a false sense of grievance that are then used to create the means of power for these people to maintain their controlling hierarchies that we've talked about so much on this show, from the rich on down. So the real question to me is, how do we counter these bad faith strategies?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this whole culture of conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking, really in the modern era traces back to an event that we just saw the milestone of go by this past week, which is 9/11. Of course you have, the JFK assassination and the moon landing, but they were a bit more fringe for a very long time. And I really feel that, 9/11 is what turned the tide culturally as far as the conspiracy stuff. So it's interesting to see what's going on now. I mean, I know Christophe has talked about being low-key obsessed with the Vietnam War, right, on the show before. Well, I'm kind of low-key obsessed with 9/11, and I don't jump on board with all the hyper-nationalistic crap. Like, I don't care about that. I'm just talking about, like, as an event, I find it immensely fascinating, and just, I don't think there's a clear dividing line between old world and new. I don't think we'll see something like that in our lifetime. I don't think there'll be a single more cataclysmic event or day. I mean, obviously none of us know the future, but I don't know that we'll see something that so drastically shifts our culture and our world politics in just the matter of a few hours like that. So it's just crazy stuff to think about to me. And it's just with the anniversary having just passed, and with what we're seeing now in our country versus what we saw directly after 9/11 in terms of the sense of unity, and now this sense of division between people who understand science and understand the need for vaccines and like evidence when you're trying to make a case for something. And then these psychos who buy into conspiracy theories. So I think it all ties in.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned that. I mean, the only event that I think would be worse, more defining, is if like a nuke went off in an American city, or multiple nukes. I mean, now that would make 9/11 look like a picnic. But I think anytime you have an event like that, there's always a attempt by everybody to try to frame it. And what I find interesting is that the coalition of people who believe that 9/11 was staged or an inside job is about a third. And that is also almost exactly the same size as the Trump coalition.
Right.
Yeah. Only about a third of people actually really support the guy. Right. So it's just, it is, we could always find time to say more things about 9/11, but I want to move on to another event, which we just heard about this week, which is the pre-release of the Bob Woodward and Robert Costa book, Peril. Okay, and that book comes out the 21st, which I believe is the day after the show airs. But the real kind of sizzle that happened was the quote where General Mark Milley talked about deauthorizing the use of nuclear and conventional weapons by Trump after January 6th. And this is like it's blown everybody's mind. Everybody is just freaking out about this and reacting terribly, frankly, to what was really a wise and patriotic action. We would hope that no general would follow a whacked out presidential order to launch a strike, say, against China, right? Which would result in massive damage to both countries. So instead, General Milley calmly called his Chinese counterpart, whose name is General Li Zuocheng of the People's Liberation Army, to reassure him that the U.S. was not about to start a war. And they had like an hour conversation. And there's just all this batshit Republican rage over the incident. Like, how dare they, take away, civilian authority of Trump? The guy was insane. He was out of his mind. Okay. And the same people like Rand Paul, Marjorie Taylor Greene are saying that Milley should be court-martialed. You don't court-martial the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay. And Trump is on there, on Newsmax saying that General Milley should be arrested. Like, who's going to fucking arrest, the highest military official in our country? But the whole thing is just pathetic. And another person who I would have expected more from was Colonel Vindeman. And Colonel Vindeman, he knows how crazy Trump is. I mean, look at the revenge plot that Trump took on Vindeman and his brother, okay, after the first impeachment hearings, right? And now Vindeman is kind of defending Trump and defending his civilian authority. And it's like, he's kind of a perfect example of a career military man who doesn't understand the multispectral warfare that we're involved in right now, or that America's in a state of cold civil war. And we're no longer in this place where we could just kind of do everything by the book. And there's liberal hand-wringing on this too, that we narrowly avoided this all-out war with China. It's crazy. There's no way that anyone was close to launching nukes. The system worked. And I feel like what a lot of people don't realize is that the worst danger is when nations aren't not talking, right? The fact that the military brass were in constant communication means that there was almost zero chance of a war. And I actually kind of find this whole story very reassuring. Not that it happened, but that we do have some cooler heads in place, even when someone like Trump was in charge.
This is one example of how we can think about post-liberal philosophy and modes of strategies. This is not simply about personality. It's not about Trump. It's about systems. And we should not focus just on people here. There are many issues at play which all intersect. There's militarism. There's the GOP propaganda movement. There's the institutional management of society. Then there's the whole geopolitics, landscape that we really want to focus on. What we want to avoid here is another reducto ad absurdum conversation that we see so much in the news. And I would say the same thing about the Afghanistan issue, the Afghanistan crisis that we just went through. We really need to start thinking about this stuff systemically. And this is what post-liberalism in part is about.
Yeah, seeing the big picture. Was there anything you wanted to say about that, Drew?
I like you, Sean, found this story reassuring. It's hard because on one hand, you're thinking, what are these people doing going along with this administration and retaining these positions and carrying out various things and whatnot? But then on the other hand, it's like you want someone kind of sane to hold these positions so stuff like that doesn't happen. And, Trump can't launch nukes at Rosie O'Donnell or whatever. Yeah,
well, and if there is a fascist takeover, okay, and that is longer term, they would purge all such people, and you would get someone who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who would follow a crazy order from someone like Trump. And by the way, I want to mention also that after this controversy broke, President Biden released a statement expressing complete confidence in General Milley, so his job is safe. And apparently also he's going to be speaking to Congress about his actions in the next few weeks. And, you can only imagine what the Republicans are going to say to him. But all right, well, enough about that. Let's move on to Florida's continuing COVID compliance nightmare. Last week, Governor Ron DeSantis is making an ass of himself again by threatening to fine local governments for compliance with federal vaccine mandates. And so, I mean, when you really think about this, it's hilarious. A governor who, number one, hates government, now using government to fine the government millions of dollars. I mean, it's just an ever-loving circus sideshow act. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I think, this is similar to what's happening with the Newsom issue, what happened with this election here. I think the Republicans are really starting to scare people, like other than their own base. They're really acting kind of crazy, and I think it's becoming more and more noticeable. And even with this pandemic, people just want the pandemic to be dealt with, right? They want to move on, and they're okay. Most people are okay with getting vaccinated and wearing masks and so forth. You have this core that isn't, but the majority is. And even in Florida, I think that's probably true, right? And I think in the end, they're really going to undermine their power by continuing to do this. I mean, I could be wrong, but we hope, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really infuriating to see the behavior of someone like DeSantis, who, by the way, is like apparently one of the top frontrunners for the Republican nomination in 2024. Like this evil motherfucker. But it's hard for me to wrap my head around some of his actions. Me being a guy who, as I've said before on the show, is way more in favor of way more draconian measures regarding vaccines and masks and mandate than most Americans are. Like at this point, I'm pretty much on team hold the fuckers down and jab them. Like really, like I'm so fucking over it.
I mean, I'm right there, and it, they can't get jobs, they can't go anywhere, and if they get somebody sick, they get charged with manslaughter, right? I mean, like, come the fuck on, people.
So yeah, I mean, I think you're right about the vaccinations and so forth, but I think the point you made earlier, Sean, about the GOP being just tying itself up in ideological knots is really interesting. I think this question of government power, which they're always against, and they're now using like crazy, is one of those knots. The other one is the stance of respecting private property, and by extension, the independence of corporate decision making, right? And so many corporations now are pursuing mandates for themselves, like Raytheon just announced this week. Same with companies, in a way, similar to social justice standards, right? Companies are abiding by and the right is just going crazy. It's like, well, make up your fucking mind, right?
Yeah. Well, corporations are to the left of the Republican Party. It used to be the other way around, right?
Right. Way to the left in some cases.
Yeah. And so that's just it, right? Like they are constantly loving to rail against the tech companies. I mean, we have our own beefs with the tech companies, but are they a private company or are they not, right? So anyway, okay. Well, it's just ongoing, and this isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. And I think that, it's right now, it's a question. We're going to get a DeSantis or a Pence or, somebody, in the winning the primary if Trump doesn't run. If he runs, he wins the primary. So that's how this is going to go. If I have anything to, if I've ever been right about any prediction, that one's pretty much of a no-brainer.
Seems so.
Agreed.
Okay, well, let's move on now to a little bit talking about culture, because the next right-wing meltdown that happened this last week was about the Met Gala, and specifically about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's dress that said "Tax the Rich." And it was awesome. I mean, it was an awesome dress. It was a pitch-perfect message delivered right into the teeth of one of the nation's most exclusive celebrity events, a $35,000 per person event. And naturally, everyone from all sides of the political spectrum came unglued, including some other progressive groups that were mad that she stole attention from their own protest. I hate that so much.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we need to come together. Like, the right doesn't do this.
No.
They're in lockstep. And meanwhile, we're, other progressives are bickering with AOC.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
At the end of the day, the message is what matters.
It is. And if they're I don't know what it was. It was a fur protest. I don't know what it was. It was some other thing across the street that was going on, and these people were upset. It's like, you guys have YouTube like anybody else. You can post your stuff, right? But of course, the other thing is that conservatives are just lying about this. They were accusing AOC of hypocrisy because she always talks about the poor, and the event cost $35,000. Well, she didn't pay that price. Her tickets were comped, and Even if she had, okay, it is a platform for her to spread her message. Even if she had used campaign funds, okay, what she's doing there is she's speaking to the world, and that message was heard loud and clear. And I think that's what really upsets them. But there's other stuff that happened there too. I mean, the other people, you know, Lil Nas X wore this outrageous outfit, and he is just his trolling level is so expert for the right, and I love it.
Yeah, you know, his music isn't necessarily something that I'm going to throw on when I'm in my car personally. Like, I'm into like punk rock and hardcore and metal and stuff, but I like him so much as an artist and as a human being. I thought the Montero video was a masterpiece. I wish him all the best with this new record of his. And yeah, his trolling and his clapbacks to right-wing punditry and critique is just chef's kiss.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there were multiple other people too. Billie Eilish was seen in a way that we've never seen her before. I mean, she looks very much like Marilyn Monroe, kind of a styling. And, you know, but it wasn't just the dress, okay, because this was Oscar de la Renta, huge fashion designer. And she just said, I'm not going to wear your dress unless you permanently renounce the use of animal fur. And they did. And that's social change right there. I mean, right in front of our eyes. Okay. And then the one that I really want to talk about here, though, is Cara Delevingne, who wore what looked like kind of a white corset by Christian Dior with the words "Peg the Patriarchy" on it, which I find insanely hilarious. Apparently, though, more left-on-left violence here. There's now some controversy about this from a Canadian business owner whose name is Luna Matatis, who coined the phrase "peg the patriarchy" several years ago and trademarked it in Canada for her BDSM clothing and sex toy company. But, you know, honestly, I couldn't give less of a fuck about her claim of appropriation because this gained global publicity. It's perfect and it's on the nose. And I'm just like, should the Christian Dior people have given her credit? Of course they should have. And now the internet is doing that anyway. She's getting the credit. And the whole mess, though, misses the larger point. No one controls language. Once someone coins a word or phrase and puts it out into the world, they lose all control over how that linguistic token or meme is used in the future, even if they trademark it in a given country. And this is especially true when that meme goes global, giving it broader impact. For a person to claim appropriation at that point means they basically care more about their own publicity than about the larger goals of social justice. It seems to me it's much more important to fight the patriarchy now and fight about your trademark later. And this it's another example, Joe, of what you were saying about about post-liberalism. We always prioritize the greater good.
Right.
And for this purpose, the reason I think it's important is because Peg the Patriarchy is a perfect takedown, and it's simultaneously an encapsulation of the male fragility and homophobia that holds the patriarchy together into its straitjacket of heteronormativity and vanilla missionary sex.
And it's funny.
It's funny as hell. And
it's funny, yeah.
It's a message that needs to resonate. And I have to say one more thing about the Met Gala, and that concerns this awful, horrific Wall Street Journal pundit Peggy Noonan, who took the opportunity in her column to dismiss the Met Gala as a freak show. Because of course it is, right? Everything is a freak show to conservatives. And she wrote this column sort of reflecting a little bit on what you said, Drew, that America was losing the thread. And the thread that she was talking about was this post 9/11 unity, right? But we all know all of the reasons why America has lost that thread. And in her column, she chalks it up to these cultural issues. And that's not the problem here. The problem is military industrial complex, tax cuts for the wealthy, money in politics, all of the things that have hamstrung our democracy and our ability to find that unity. So anyway, I just had to get that in there.
Well said.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this kind of high level trolling. I found the AOC dress to be, that was probably my favorite. And I have criticisms of her and the squad on occasion. You know, there are times when I disagree with them, and that's okay. But man, if it's between them and the GQP, hell, I'll take the squad any day.
Any day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'd put them in charge tomorrow. Like those four, they could just run it. They could just run America. No problem.
You know, it's funny, guys. I saw this meme on my Facebook feed a couple of days ago of like somebody that sort of changed the dress and put, instead of like, you know, text to rich, they put Trump won, right? It was a right-wing meme. And I'm like, what the fuck is this doing on my feed, right? And it was like a liberal friend of mine who decided to tell him, oh, that wasn't a nice thing to do. I'm like, no, don't engage with it, right? Don't engage with these people, because all you're doing is spreading their message. I wouldn't have even seen that meme if he hadn't done that, right? And that's one of the important things that we have to think about. And really, the real issue here is the class war that we're under, that the rich have been waging against poor people and working people in this country for decades, right? And so, is this the best we can do, right? This is why we need post-liberalism, right? We've got to do better.
Yeah, well, you know, these are all, you wonder why people are angry? They've been robbed, okay? 2008, something like, you know, $10 trillion were stolen out of the American economy. I mean, it's happened repeatedly, okay? Every time there's a collapse, every time there's a tax cut, every time there's a budget cut, it just hollows out the economy more, and it hurts the middle class, and people are enraged. And so they look for a scapegoat. Republicans give them a scapegoat.
Right. And we were being robbed in 2000. We were robbed of our presidency. We've been robbed of 2 Supreme Court seats. I mean, come on, people.
All right. Well, Joe, you had some information to present to us today on the climate crisis, and I want to make sure we get that in.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be brief, but I do want to mention it because I think it's so critical. The goal of achieving net zero emissions, which we've all been told about, right, is further off than many of us thought, unfortunately. 2 recent scientific undertakings have shown that the emission problem is far more extensive than reported. And so, for example, Climate Trace, a privately funded collaboration by Al Gore and several climate think tanks that utilize really cool technology, satellite data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, to determine greenhouse gas emissions globally. And it aims to usher in an era of what they call radical transparency, which is really critically needed, right? And to be able to enforce these climate agreements, right? To hold people accountable, to hold governments accountable and corporations accountable. And, you know, the UN wants actionable intelligence, and this is what this is all about, to track down these polluters. It has found that emissions are perhaps twice as bad as officially reported among the top emitting nations. That's just staggering. This helps explain, I think, why, despite the global emissions dropping by almost 7% because of the pandemic last year, the atmospheric carbon load went up by 2.5%. Right?
Insane.
Another one is the Watchdog Climate Action Tracker, CAT, that analyzed policies of 36 countries, as well as the European Union, and found that all major economies, all of them, were off track to contain global warming to 1.5 degrees C above the pre-industrial levels. The countries together, these powerful countries, these top countries, make up about 80% of the world's emissions, right? And they are off track. And we think we will link these articles here on the show notes so you guys can read them. But what do you think, guys? I mean, is there anything positive in any of this? I mean, what can we do?
You know, we could just do what we've been doing and scream it from the rooftops. I mean, it becomes harder and harder to ignore at a certain point. We saw recently the floods from the storms in New York on the East Coast, and those images of the subways getting rained down upon and just flooded like something out of the Bible. Like, it's crazy. So yeah, I mean, I think that eventually the science just kind of speaks for itself, but you know, is there a positive in it? I don't know, but I do think that eventually it becomes impossible to ignore.
Maybe that's the positive.
Well, we are not ready for this. Okay, we are not ready for what's coming any more than we were ready for COVID. I mean, it's going to hit everybody. They're just going to be like, as these things occur, and it's so funny how they're being normalized. Like even the storm damage is being normalized, and even the fact that Miami streets have 6 inches of water coming up from underground and things like that. You're just like, oh ho hum, people who you thought immediately would probably move if something like that happened. They're like, no. I read an article about a guy, he's jacking up his house 4 feet, right? That's the response. Not going to move, just going to jack his house up 4 feet, right? So I've come to the conclusion probably a while ago that we are not going to have a governmental solution to this problem. And so therefore we're relying on the market to make this transition. And fortunately, solar and wind plus battery storage are cheaper than anything. Cheaper. They're the cheapest source of energy. And fortunately, suddenly their companies are building factories that can pump out millions of electric cars. Okay. Last year, it's not much, it's not enough, but last year, electric vehicles saved 500 million gallons of gasoline in the United States. Now, that's about 11 million barrels of oil.
Yeah.
Which is about 1 day's, it's less than 1 day's consumption, but still, you got to start somewhere. And that is oil that will never be used again. Like it's not just this year, it's next year. And next year there'll be twice as many electric cars. The year after that, 3 times as many. So we're seeing that we're starting to nibble away at it. It's not fast enough. But I think we have to look at the political system as part of the planetary physics at this point, because we're not reacting well to this.
No. And what I struggle with as an educator, as a father, honestly, because my son is struggling with this, is, according to a scientific survey I saw by Lancet Planetary Health, really good, reputable, institution, nearly half of all young people surveyed, more than 45% said their feelings about climate change negatively affected their daily life and functioning, right? According to this study. So that's pretty powerful. I certainly see that in my own personal life, as I said, among my students, among my son, among other young people. And this is significant. Young people are experiencing widespread, according to this study, psychological distress over government handling of looming climate crisis. Not about the climate crisis, but about how the government is failing to act, right? And the mental health damage that climate disasters, climate disruptions are causing are only going to get exponentially worse. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's all pretty accurate. I definitely feel some of that, depression at times, especially, I mean, the combination of climate and COVID. Yeah, it's depressing as hell. How can you not be depressed by it is what I'd be wondering. But it's difficult to look to the future and think, oh, we're all spreading this, horrible virus, or all of the major cities on all the coastlines are going to be underwater. So what's the fucking point of anything, right? Like, it's really easy to fall into that kind of despair, I think, especially if you're a young person looking at the next, 70 years or whatever of the scientific future of this planet. So it's tricky. It's tricky. And for me, I've coped by delving more into my hobbies, but even that gets disrupted by this stuff through some of the issues with supply chains and production that we're seeing all across the world. And I think, Joe, before this taping, I think we were talking about maybe planning a future episode kind of based around that. Yeah. So we'll have more to say about that. But yeah, the world's a sick, fucked up place right now. It's understandable that young people would be depressed.
Yeah, I think I read a study that was talking about how about a third of young people think it's too late and there's no way to save the planet, they're exactly where the fossil fuel industry wants them, giving up hope because they've been watching watching their government fail them. Okay, and it makes perfect sense. And I saw this meme, and a lot of people are posting very bitter, very apocalyptic memes right now. And one of them I saw was, "This is collapse. It's not going to be, things are just going to keep getting worse until it's over." right? And there's not going to be any one catastrophic event. This is what collapse looks like. And that is the way a lot of young people are thinking right now.
Yeah, it is.
And it's terrible.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to, I don't want to get too maudlin here because we do have a great guest segment coming up. And our guest is Doug Berger. He is the founder and host of the Secular Left podcast. He is also the host of the Glass City Humanist podcast and is the founder and president of the Secular Humanists of Western Lake Erie. He has been a member of the humanist community of Central Ohio since 1995, serving as its president from 2001 to 2002, and serving on the board of directors off and on from 1995 to 2014. He was the editor of the Central Ohio Humanist newsletter from 2000 to 2007, which named him Humanist of the Year in 2013. He was the co-chair for the Secular Coalition for Ohio, a chapter of the Secular Coalition for America, from 2013 to 2018. He is also an out and proud atheist. So, without further delay, The Radical Secular presents Doug Berger. Welcome to the show, Doug. We are so glad you had us on your show, and we're very happy to return the favor.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely, Doug. Thanks for being here, man. This is going to be real fun.
All right, well, let's start off with the t-shirts. We got to do it. Start with you, Doug. What are you wearing?
I am doing some self-promotion.
Excellent.
Stand up a little bit.
The Secular Left podcast, and that's the one that Christophe and I were on, and we just replayed that a few weeks ago on The Radical Secular. And also, you have another podcast, right?
Yes, I do an outreach for my humanist group. It's called Glass City Humanist. And it's focused mainly on Toledo and Northwest Ohio and humanist issues, social justice issues.
Very good. And Ohio certainly needs that.
Definitely.
Christophe, what do you got? What are you wearing?
Yeah, so today I'm rocking my Crooked Media podcast, my Pod Save America shirt, which is a Crooked Media production. And I always loved how they sort of repurposed that sort of name. And I think the Crooked Media label, and I thought that was brilliant back then when they started it out. And so I thought that given that we're talking about the media today and the so-called left-wing media, which will challenge that concept, I think, a little bit today, I figured I might as well wear the shirt.
Very cool. Well, today I already went over this in the opening segment, but I'm just going to show you guys again briefly. This is a Ming the Merciless t-shirt.
Oh,
it has
cool.
absolutely nothing to do with politics, but it's like I was going for the most obscure Star Trek reference ever because this is the villain in Flash Gordon, okay? And Flash Gordon was the inspiration for the Captain Proton holodeck program from Star Trek Voyager. So it's all a big circle.
Nice. And we got to mention Star Trek obviously comes up in every episode. Practically every single episode we mention Star Trek one way or another. So
we always do. All right, well, let's get down to business. Today, Doug, we're going to talk to you about both sidesism in the liberal media. And I know you have some strong opinions on this, but at first I kind of want to set the tone for where we're coming from. All of us here at the Radical Secular are strong supporters of the Democratic Party, Obama Democrats, as Christophe says. But that's not the same thing as saying that we fully embrace the approach of liberal media. We all, of course, read the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Miami Herald, San Francisco Chronicle, all the other papers of record. And if we watch TV news, it's going to be CNN or MSNBC or ABC or CBS. And those are indeed all the best sources. But it's also near universal in liberal circles to direct our daily 2 minutes hate towards Fox News and its various right-wing copycats and surrogates like Newsmax and OAN, et cetera, Breitbart, it goes on and on. Gateway Pundit. I certainly agree that these outlets have done tremendous damage to our country and that damage is increasing every day. But I don't think we spend enough time talking about how much damage is also done by what we would normally consider to be friendly, fact-based liberal news sources. I can think of a lot of examples. One from this week comes to mind immediately. CNN ran an editorial on its front page with the headline, "Biden is not living up to his promises." And the article proceeds to claim that Biden has broken his promises on COVID and is governing like Trump, a reference to Biden's executive orders. Now, the whole claim is obviously just preposterous unless you consider the source. The author of the editorial was Scott Jennings, a CNN contributor and Republican campaign advisor who is a former special assistant to President George W. Bush and a former campaign advisor to Senator Mitch McConnell. So what the hell's going on here? We have Fox News for people like that. Why does CNN have to do this? So this sets up my very first question for you, Doug. Is a liberal news outlet like CNN obligated to print opposing views? Is this considered both sidesism, or is this them just being a responsible journalistic platform?
Well, if you listen to CNN, they are trying to be a objective journalistic outlet. They are not obligated to give both sides of a story, or multiple sides, because usually there's multiple sides. Mm-hmm. Because they are not a broadcaster. They don't have a license from the FCC. It's a cable channel. It's a private company. They can put on whatever they want. They want ratings. Mm-hmm. So they like the game. They like the battle, the drama, whether they have to manufacture it or not. So that's why you see a lot of these outlets like CNN and even MSNBC, they hire these people that are not technically liberal. Mm-hmm. They may have worked with the Obama administration or with Hillary Clinton, but they are middle of the road, and they tisk more liberal people like AOC and the squad in the House of Representatives. And so they're not. So to answer your question, CNN is not obligated to give both sides. They claim that they do, but they don't.
Yeah, I mean, but my question, just to follow up on that a little bit, do you think that, I mean, are there two sides? Like, is there a reason to give these Republican hacks a platform at all?
Yeah, I would think it would depend on something. If you're talking about policy, like implementing public policy, there can be two sides to that. Mm-hmm. There is not two sides to evidence and data. And so if you're basing your policy on false evidence and data, then your view of that policy is wrong. And it should be noted that it's wrong, but you hardly ever see that on on the cable channels or in the Washington Post or the New York Times. You know, they always give the benefit of the doubt to the other side.
Yeah, great points all around, guys. There's a couple of things that popped into my head. First of all, that especially during the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, and Sean, you and I talk about this a lot online, and we've talked about it in general. That was when you really saw Fox News hitting its stride, right? Like, That was at their peak, right? They had some at that point found this balance between saying like genuinely like lying, right, and outrageous stuff, and retaining the veneer of legitimacy. And they had found that balance. And for that entire time, the Karl Rove era, right, they were unbelievably effective. And what you saw then were outlets like CNN and of course MSNBC trying to out Fox, right? So, and that's when you said because Fox was, that kind of journalism, that kind of opinion stuff that Fox was doing, it's like crack, right? I mean, watching people go after each other, hearing an echo chamber of things you already want to hear, like they really did a great job on that. And so, I really think that you saw a real change in those networks as they tried to, over that era, as they tried to sort of compete with Fox. And a lot of that did come along and also throw off the crooked media, liberal bias sort of name that was thrown on them by the right. So they gave the platform to some of these other people. And one thing I wanted to comment on as well, is that you talked about how that in terms of the data is uncontroversial, right? Like that sort of thing is not on the table for like, oh yeah, let's give this both sides, because there's only one side to that. And I think that's right. And I think also that since the Trump era, and this is one of the I always look at the silver lining, right? Obama Democrat, is that Trump made it okay to call a politician a liar. right? Before that, it was always like he was like they would say they would have different ways and euphemisms to talk about someone not telling the truth. But now you have people, at least on the liberal media side, just saying the president falsely claims that X, Y, and Z. That is new, right? That is like a post-Trump era thing. And I think that's notable as well. Where that fits in this conversation, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, I think it's notable.
Well, yeah, and it's like you both have mentioned, okay, a lot of these liberal media outlets felt that they needed a token conservative.
Yes.
And they felt that they needed to address the sort of right-wing bad faith argument that, because what we're talking about here, these papers of record and the big three networks and CNN, that was the media. There was no other media. That's just the media, right? And all of a sudden now, when Fox News got its start, they started accusing them of being, okay, you're the liberal media, as a way of discrediting. So then the liberal media is pushing back and saying, okay, no, we got Meghan McCain on The View, we got Joe Scarborough, we've got New York Times has Brett Stevens, who came from the Wall Street Journal. It just goes on and on. There's like they're just seeded now out everywhere, all these right wingers, to sort of give these liberal outlets some kind of ability to push back. And I just, Rick Santorum is another horrible example. I mean, he left CNN May of 2021, he made outrageous and dismissive statements about Native American culture, but that dude has been saying horrible things for decades. I mean, his anti-gay stuff, so we know conservatives are going to say this stuff. CNN knows ahead of time that he's going to say this stuff. And he'd been giving CNN a black eye with his, horrible rhetoric for years, counterfactual right-wing guff, on a daily basis. And he's not even remotely the worst offender. So, I wanted to ask you another question, though, Doug. Can you give us a couple of the worst examples of what you've observed as this both sidesism in the liberal media? Who are the worst offenders in your view?
The worst offenders. Well, it would have to be the national media, television media in general, is the worst offenders. A lot of times the conservatives over at Fox, they drive the news cycle. So you'll have somebody during their daytime hours say, some say President Biden is a creep. Then you'll have then they'll have their evening pundits, and they're all pundits. They're not news people in the evening.
Right.
They'll echo, well, we had this report on Fox today that somebody said that Biden is a creep. And then
it really is like that.
Right. And then the next day, CBS News will have a report, the guy talking at the White House. Well, we wanted to talk to the president. Why are you a creep?
Right. Yeah, this kind of stuff.
What?
How did we get here?
When did you stop raping your daughter? It's basically
right. That's what comes out the other end of like the telephone game, right? One guy said, one pundit someplace said, I wonder if Joe Biden is a creep, and at the other end, Joe Biden may or may not be raping children, drinking blood, etc.
Right, and so they all fall over themselves to cover a non-story because they don't want to be labeled as liberal media.
It's true.
Even though it's a piece of crap. And the reason why it gets so much traction is because they're all on social media, and the social media just amplifies it. Because everybody shares it on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And so you have these reporters and network people that are watching it, and they're like, oh, that's a story. And it's like, no, it's not.
Right. Well, and this just all happened because it wasn't that long ago, before there was a Fox News, and when CNN was the media, like if you want to know what was going on, you turn on CNN. Done. And before that, it was the big three. With you're watching Peter Jennings, or you're watching Dan Rather, or you're watching it depends on how far back you go. Tom Brokaw, Walter Cronkite, Howard K. Smith, like all those guys, right?
David Brinkley.
Yeah. And this is like just the news. And I think what the right wing has done is it's hard to describe the damage. And for people especially who aren't old enough to remember when there was a shared truth in this country.
Yeah, there was journalistic ethics. And when you did a research, my background in college, I took journalism in college. And basically, you had to get your sources. They were telling you a story. You had to verify that story. So you had to get other sources that weren't related to that previous thing. And if you got that, then you went with the story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if somebody called you up and said, hey, Biden's creepy, you didn't go and say, and type in your typewriter, Biden's creepy, because the editor would fire you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's all gone now. It's all about ratings. It's all about entertainment and pseudo drama.
What do you guys think about this? I just was jotting this down as we were talking, and I wonder if you think that my logic here is correct. So, and we're going to talk a little bit. Well, maybe I should save this actually for the FCC discussion. Actually, you know what? I'll save it for that because I think that's important, and I think it'll connect better there. I will say this though. I think in terms of who both sides thinks the worst in the quote liberal media, if I had to guess, I would go with New York Times, and I think that the New York Times is. And then I think the biggest problem with the New York Times version of that is the New York Times retains, certainly among liberals, but still I think among most people, this air of legitimacy. It's the oldest, the gray lady. It's one of the classic ones. And so when they give a platform to an asshole, or they amplify a bad story, I think it can be particularly toxic. I mean, when I think of the Washington Post now, especially since Bezos took over it, for me, it's changed a little bit. It's sort of, in my mind, although not like for real, but it sort of takes it down a notch in my mind for some reason. I don't think that's really fair, but I think that's my emotional reaction to it. Mm-hmm. The Times, though, is much more a centrist organization in general, but I do think that they give platforms to people who, or ideas. They give legitimacy to ideas that are baseless and that are dangerous. So I think that is my gut reaction to that question.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And I was just thinking as you were talking again, I mean, just the Bret Stephens is particularly egregious. And the New York Times also had hired Barry Weiss. But and Bret Stephens, though, is a climate denier. I mean, just flat out. And he came from the Wall Street Journal, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winning guy. And right. So it's like he has a lot of credibility. The New York Times gives him even more credibility. And then he pushes this bullshit.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a problem. Well, I wanted to, I'll read this section here about the Fairness Doctrine because that is what has changed. That is the main thing that changed. And I want to preface it by saying, though, that the Fairness Doctrine only applied to broadcast media. As you mentioned earlier, Doug, I mean, CNN's cable, they wouldn't have had to comply with it anyway. Neither would Fox. So all these liberals who are constantly running around saying, bring back the Fairness Doctrine, it's irrelevant. But let's just talk about what it did here. I want to read from Wikipedia. Quote, the Fairness Doctrine of the United States Federal Communications Commission, introduced in 1949, was a policy that required the holders of broadcast licenses both to present controversial issues of public importance and to do so in a manner that was honest, equitable, and balanced. The FCC eliminated the policy in 1987 and removed the rule that implemented the policy from the Federal Register in August 2011. The Fairness Doctrine had two basic elements. It required broadcasters to devote some of their airtime to discussing controversial matters of public interest and to air contrasting views regarding those matters. Stations were given wide latitude as to how to provide contrasting views. It could be done through news segments, public affairs shows, or editorials. The doctrine did not require equal time for opposing views, but required that contrasting viewpoints be presented. The demise of this FCC rule has been considered by some to be a contributing factor for the rising level of party polarization in the United States. The Fairness Doctrine is not the same as the equal time rule, which is still in place. The Fairness Doctrine deals with the discussion of controversial issues, while the equal time rule deals only with political candidates. So, this brings me to my next question for you, Doug. Do you think that the both-sidesism in the liberal media results from those media outlets still trying to cling to the Fairness Doctrine, even though the other side doesn't? Is this even a question of fairness, or is it more cynical than that, just a desire to cast a broader net for conservative viewers?
Yes. No, I think it is the media's attempt to be balanced wrongly. They do it wrong, but they are attempting to be balanced. and to appeal to a wider audience who think that they're just liberal biased media. And that's why they keep doing it wrong, because they keep playing into that same game of letting Fox News drive the news cycle.
Yeah.
What's the solution?
Personally, I would like to see a return of the Fairness Doctrine, and I think it should apply to everybody, broadcasters and cable. If you consider yourself a news channel and you disseminate news, it should apply to you. And it should apply to you because your bullhorn overrides a lot of background noise. So people get a lot of their news from cable, from newspapers, from the broadcasters over, and the stuff that's shared on social media. Now, one of the reasons that they gave for doing away with the Fairness Doctrine in '87 was that there was more outlets available for these controversial topics. They didn't take into consideration that conservative radio would take over radio and a lot of the TV broadcasters. And plus you have all these 6 media companies own like 90% of the news outlets in the United States.
Right.
And so they didn't take that in consideration. And so I think it should be, because it's for the common good, that they should be forced to discuss topics, controversial topics, and provide actually both sides of that topic.
Yeah, and wasn't there another rule, ownership rules, where you could only have a TV station in, I believe it was 2 or 3 cities. Each entity could only have in 2 or 3 major metropolitan areas. I'm not familiar with the name of that, but I believe that was also done away with.
Yeah, it was. I don't know the exact details, but it was like 1 or 2 TV stations. And if you had a newspaper, you could only have a radio station or something like that, because back then they realized that you could monopolize the airwaves and be overpower everybody else's speech.
Yeah. One of the themes that I've been one of the ideas that I've been banging around my head for the last couple months is this just basic statement: capitalism poisons everything. And that is obviously a reference to Christopher, to Hitch, right? Right. I'm thinking with the same guy, right? That religion poisons everything. And I think, frankly, for similar reasons, capitalism poisons everything. But I say that because, and this was my point I was going to say before, is that when you privatize the news, the entire news system, right? You privatize that, and that's right. This is capitalism. Capitalism, by its goal, right? A capitalist goal is to monopolize the entire field, right? That is the job of the capitalist, right? A monopoly is the ultimate goal, theoretically, of the capitalist, right? So when you need to control people. If you need that means you need ratings. If you need ratings, you need to control people. If you want to control people, you go to their emotions, right? If you want to go to that's how you control people is through emotional bonds, right? You bypass reason. That is how you control people, right? That is if you can't physically dominate them, right? And so this is why propaganda is so effective, et cetera. And so that means, and political issues or hot button issues get people emotional. Hot button issues are political issues, right? So then you end up with, it seems to me that if you start with privatizing the news, you end with where we are now. I don't see how you don't get here.
Yeah.
What are you saying, Sean? Go ahead.
Well, okay, so there's 2 things, right? There's the agenda of the wealthy and advertisers, corporate agenda, and then there's also telling people what they want to hear versus what they need to hear. And this is a really good segue, because this next section I want to talk about, I have a longtime friend on Facebook who is he's a former politician in the state of Maine. You know who he is. I'm not going to mention his name because he's sensitive about that. But he claims that it's impossible for any ad-supported media to effectively hold people accountable under the capitalist system. And the reason he gives is because those newspapers, TV, and radio stations ultimately need to keep advertisers happy, which is obvious. But furthermore, he's talked to me about the problems of private media ownership in which wealthy media owners can steer narratives away from exploring any uncomfortable areas. For example, Washington Post recently ran an editorial against the wealth tax. Well, I wonder why, right? So they can easily push any destructive counter-narrative against progress, as we've seen in spades in recent years. And this is the huge matter of record in history. We have a plethora of infamous examples of right-wing media ownership, from Rupert Murdoch to 20th century examples like William Randolph Hearst and Henry Ford, who was a known fascist and published the Dearborn Independent, which was an early 20th century newspaper that got sued out of existence for its blatant anti-Semitism. We know that billionaires Robert and Rebecca Mercer initially funded Breitbart News and, got Steve Bannon launched into the White House, and were even involved in starting the social network Parler. And so there are hundreds of examples of right-wingers who are controlling the narrative. And that brings me to my next question for you, Doug, which is, given the fact that anyone with enough money can set up shop, call themselves a news organization, and start publishing, is it possible to ever expect fair news coverage under the capitalist system? And if so, how?
I don't think under the capitalist model, you're not going to get fair news coverage. Because of the capitalist model, you've had the massive consolidation that's taken place, especially newspapers. And so many communities only have one newspaper. And it's, for example, in Columbus, Ohio, USA Today bought the Columbus Dispatch. Here in Toledo, it's still independently owned, but they only print 2 days a week. The rest of it's online. And so if they want to make money off of it, which is the goal of having a newspaper, they can't do it under the capitalist model. It's not, you can't do it, especially with the internet. Everybody wants everything for free.
And that's a great point.
They can get news wherever they can. So it really leaves newspapers out. But I think for news media in general, I think you can really go with a public support route. And it would have to be regionalized or localized more so than national.
Sure. One thing that you said earlier, Sean, that I keep coming back to is this idea of the importance of a shared truth, right? Like that is, or the lack of one. And when we don't have that, right, we can't function as a democracy, and let alone move forward in terms of scientific discovery or whatever else. And so I love the public access idea. It seems to me that is such a public good. I mean, right, or even something, right, like the way we deal with utilities, right? It's like, it's heavily regulated. So yeah, it might be a private organization, but it's like extremely heavily regulated. And so, because we realize that this is something that we cannot do without, right? People cannot, and I think that we need to, as a culture, as a country, put a shared basic truth as one of those public goods. And I think that, like you say, removing the cap of the sort of profit motive and out of it is the only way, even if it's just an alternative, right? Like, right. Maybe there still are private things, right? Sort of like the public option, right? And then people can say, like, there is a baseline though. If you want to go have your Yahoo crazy news, go for that. But there is a baseline.
Well, it's interesting because if you actually look at it though, we see the system as broken, but there's a lot of very powerful interests who like it just fine the way it is. They like being able to steer the news. They like being able to sneer at and mock and attack Democrats just like routinely. Like they have a machine right now, a smear machine. Anything a Democrat says, the social media comments are going to be vile, just hundreds of vile comments. The talk shows, it's just tweets. I mean, everything is just a shitstorm anytime anyone tries to do something good. And the same would be true, by the way, regarding any attempt to reform the media. They would just consider it, this is a power grab by elites. You're trying to shut down, you're trying to silence right-wing voices, just like what they're doing now with social media companies. Social media companies are extremely right wing, and it's been proven over and over again by the surveys of who gets page views, who gets shares, who has to comply, who gets put in jail, all that kind of stuff. Those statistics are very, very heavily slanted. Facebook is like 2/3 right wing, and I don't know what it is for Twitter or whatever, but it's kind of a like, we can theorize about how to solve the problem, but there's a lot of powerful interests that like it just fine the way it is, and they just want to throw even more mud. And so this de-evolution, okay, starting with AM talk radio that we've mentioned and the launch of Fox News in 96, the explosion of internet news that began to take shape kind of after around mid-90s, no one really understood the significance of what was happening and that we would end up here. You know, if you were someone who just watched the news, you could consider yourself fairly well informed. And maybe, in addition to the big three, you might watch PBS. There was no alternative right-wing ecosystem that was a free-for-all, right? I mean, that's just like, that just didn't exist. And now people pick the news that fits their narratives. Like, if you tried to jerk this needle out of their arm, they would fight you like a fucking drowning person. They want to be self-selected into tribes, and those tribes inhabit completely different realities. So here's my question, though. Is it a mistake maybe to think of the news media as divided into liberal and conservative outlets? And knowing what we know about both foreign and domestic actors who are trying to spread this propaganda, do you think, Doug, that there is any way that we could have built the internet without also building this polarization into the system? Was the media circus inevitable in your view?
Yeah, well, I think it was inevitable because we have a long history of it. If you look back in your history, newspapers used to smear John Adams, President John Adams, during the election, and then you had the yellow journalism of Hearst. And you could go to the history of many towns and cities, and they would have, like our town, Findlay, where I'm from, we had the Findlay Democrat and the Findlay Republican newspapers.
Oh, really?
So two separate, right. And they supported one side or the other, but at least you knew that that's what they did. All right. So then I'm not really sure on my history on when this started molding and melding together. But if you're going to have a business or have a news channel or something where you're basing it on being objective and presenting all sides to a story, then you need to do that. And if not, you need to let us know that you're not going to do that. To add to what Sean was talking about with the return of the Fairness Doctrine, I would really strongly advocate having a disclaimer, that you would have to display a disclaimer wherever at the beginning of the program or after each commercial break that the views expressed on this program are the people on this program. And if you want more information, go to this website, and they would have to maintain a website with the pros and cons of whatever it is they're talking about. That's what I would say.
I'd love to see that too. And but I mean, Christophe, what do you think? I mean, I think the Republicans would just howl.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, for the reasons why you said before, right? There is every reason to control the narrative, especially when the objective facts aren't on your side, right? So, for example, climate change. For example, trickle down economics. For example, racism, and every sort of identity based issue. They're wrong on the facts, right? They are consistently that way, and it doesn't. I'm not saying that conservatives don't never have good ideas. I'm not saying that's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that certainly in the way that they are losing every single battle culturally. The way that it's set up right now, the system that they've set up right now is losing every single battle culturally. So, that is why. So there's no good reason for them to change anything. In fact, there's every reason to double down. And we see that every time we think this is going to be it, right? After the Obama years, they're like, they're going to, during the Obama years, they're going to, after Obama won the first time, that is, they're going to do some self-reflection. You'll see. Absolutely not. They doubled down. After Trump literally tried literal insurrection, and they've doubled down. Like, right. So there's no reason to think that there's no reason to think they'll change unless they are absolutely forced. And I think that is where we are. And to get back to the sort of main thrust of the question is, we are in the wild west of the internet, right? Like for us, we're living through it. So it seems like the internet's been around a long time. It hasn't been though, right? So we are living in a brand new technology has been thrown into the lap of the world and Americans. And it is one of the most powerful technologies ever, if not, arguably the most, but certainly one of them. And we haven't figured out how to deal with it yet. We haven't figured it out. And so I think as long as we don't, I am optimistic that as long as we don't destroy ourselves first, and that's a big if, being a real big if, but as long as we don't destroy ourselves first, that humanity will work it out. Maybe only 500 of us left, but somebody will figure it out.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting if I go back to what you said, Doug, about there being a longer history of this, and we don't often think about that, but I just brought to mind something I remembered from looking up at the article of the Wilmington Insurrection Massacre of 1898. Okay, what's the picture that we all see of that event? It is this militia standing outside of a burned newspaper. Okay, so these attacks back and forth on media going, it was a part of our entire civil war that's been going on in this country from the very beginning. And like you said, the political cartoons about John Adams or even Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln, they portrayed him as an ape. Okay, so this has been a vicious battle that's been going on, and when you see the fact that they burned this black-owned newspaper, in Wilmington, it's par for the course. And here we are, 123 years later, and we're talking about the same thing.
But like I said, what's different about it though is back then they didn't try to hide it. You knew that they supported somebody or was against something in an editorial. And nowadays, like I said, they try to give that air of, we're objective journalists. And
do you guys know how, right? And please correct me if I'm wrong if you guys know about this, but from what I remember in terms of, I think at least maybe the UK, is that they do have more of a model where it's like this news outlet is just liberal. Right? This outlet is just conservative. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I kind of believe that that's true. I'll have to look into it. But I think that is an interesting, at least like you say, Doug, let's just get it out there, right? We're not going to try to pretend that we're something that we're not. I mean, maybe there's some value in that model. I don't know.
And the British also have a complaint department that if you see something in the media that you think is a lie or misinformation, you can complain to the government. I think it's a government agency. And then they can find the media that if they find out that it was false, they can find the media.
Wow.
But you would never see that here because of the First Amendment.
There's so much good regulation. And this is a story that I just saw in the last day or so. There's a hard right dude named Eric Zemmour, and he's in France, and he had to quit TV because it's being rumored that he's going to run for office, and they don't allow politicians on the air. So there's they enforce some of these boundaries, financial disclosures and political disclosures. It's a lot better, and we've actually had shows where we've talked about the First Amendment and what an issue it is, and I don't think we have time to get too deeply into that today. I'd love to have another conversation about it though, because it seems like a lot of other countries are way ahead of us in this.
Yeah.
But Doug, I don't know if you ever watched the Showtime miniseries about Roger Ailes, who was the president of Fox News up until a few years ago. It was called The Loudest Voice. Did you ever see that?
I have not watched the program, but I am familiar with Roger Ailes.
Okay. Well, The Loudest Voice, it just really goes into the backstory of it. And it was supposed to be pretty factual. And it kind of revealed that Fox News was what we all knew, that was intimately involved in the election of George W. Bush, of trying to sabotage Obama's presidency, and ultimately in the rise of Donald Trump. So now, of course, after Trump, Fox News has turned into this full-on insurrectionist, anti-vax, anti-American, basically a treason network. And, I mentioned this earlier about how we all love to hate them and what it's done to America. And I think it's well deserved. But I also think that this obscures a larger story. And that is that because of the attempts at faux fairness that we've seen in the liberal media, they also fall heavily into right-wing framing. And so This is a question I have about the rise of Donald Trump, and looking back to 2015 and this super improbable rise of this, crazy dude to the American presidency. How much of a role did the liberal media play in legitimizing what appeared to a lot of people at first to be a joke candidacy?
Yeah, I think again it was all about the pseudo drama and the entertainment factor. Because here was this reality star, supposed good businessman, which we found out was a lie. And he was running for president. And it was, he's running for president. And they gave him so much free airtime that it became prophecy, revealed prophecy or something like that. You prophesize that it's going to happen and then you do it and it happens.
For sure.
And that's what happened. And they were at fault because they're insiders. They're part of that DC culture, and they mocked him and thought he didn't have a chance. And they totally did not see the populist uprising that ended up getting him elected. Plus some election shenanigans, but that's a different story.
Yeah. How did you see that story, Christophe?
Yeah. So I think that's I think the question's really good. And as I think about this, I do think the media certainly had a role to play. I wonder, because and this goes back to what I keep saying is that capitalism poisons everything, right? If it bleeds, it leads, and Trump was absolutely bleed the blood, right? He was the
carnage,
carnage, right? And afterward, like actual carnage, right? All these 600,000 COVID deaths later. I'm not putting those all on his head, but you get my point. So I do think that that's a problem. But on the other hand, it's like they can't not cover him, right? So it's like, what do we expect them to do?
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I'm saying? Like, what do we expect them to do? Just pretend like that's not that fucking shit show out there isn't happening. It is happening, right? But what I do think, though, and this gets what I was saying earlier, is that they didn't do this in the beginning. They didn't do it until well into his presidency, and that is call a lie, right? Like they should have been doing that with candidate Trump too. And fine, if they wanted to do that with Hillary Clinton, fine, do that with Hillary Clinton as well, because she's much less likely to be lying, right? So much less likely to be lying. But call a lie. So it's tough. It's a tough one.
But the thing also too that you need to remember is political speech. You can't say that it's lying. You can't.
Right.
You can't go to court for somebody making a political speech that's lying, even though it's lying. And you can call it a lie. It's still protected by the First Amendment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's no obligation to not lie. There really, really isn't. But there's also no rule against the media saying that's a fucking lie, right? You know what I mean?
That's right. You can push back, but I think there's got to be a way to enforce standards against false advertising, right? And this is okay, because I want to go back to something else that really still bothers me about how the liberal media has covered and is covering Donald Trump, and there's really no other way to describe this than just full bore enabling. They literally handed this to him on a silver platter. So I want to read you now a brief excerpt from the debate between Donald Trump and Secretary Clinton that took place in Las Vegas on October 19th, 2016, barely 2 weeks before the election. Here we go. Quote, Chris Wallace. Mr. Trump, I want to ask you about one last question in this topic. You have been warning at rallies recently that this election is rigged and that Hillary Clinton is in the process of trying to steal it from you. Your running mate, Governor Pence, pledged on Sunday that he and you, his words, will absolutely accept the result of this election. Today, your daughter, Ivanka, said the same thing. I want to ask you here on the stage tonight, do you make the same commitment that you will absolutely, sir, that you will absolutely accept the result of this election? Trump says, I will look at it at the time. I'm not looking at anything now. I will look at it at the time. End quote. Okay, so this is infuriating. In a democracy, the only correct answer to that question by Donald Trump is, of course, I'll accept the election result. Saying I will look at it at the time, as Trump did, is signaling that he considers himself above the electoral process. And the media bought it, okay? It's an open statement of fascist intent that a candidate would refuse to accept election results. And yet everyone across the board, all the way up to the New York Times, let him get away with this. And now I know Chris Wallace works for Fox, but plenty of CNN, ABC, CBS reporters also repeatedly asked Trump this question throughout the 2016 campaign, throughout his presidency, and during and after the 2020 campaign. People are still playing into this trap, even in the California recall election, which is taking place right now today as we speak, by the way, by asking Republican officials if Larry Elder will concede if he loses. Are people nuts? I mean, the loser always has to concede. It's not a question. So my question for you, though, Doug, is how much of a role do you think the liberal press played in Donald Trump's ultimate decision to refuse to accept the 2020 election results and to cling to his narrative of election fraud?
Yeah, they played into it very well. Because they did not hold him to account. He's a businessman, so-called businessman, who is used to getting his way in everything that he does. And politics, at least the way we envision it, it doesn't work that way. There's certain things that you do, and if you lose an election, you concede and you don't lie and stuff like that. But he did all of that. He did everything wrong. And they just breathlessly reported it. They gave him free airtime about it. And even today, it's like they consider the insurrection a disagreement.
Yeah. Well,
they treat it like a disagreement.
Right. They were daring him. They were daring him to contest the election. Just daring him over and over again, repeatedly. For years, they were doing this.
Yeah. That's a really great point, Sean. It's almost as if they were trying to get him to say that, right? And that goes to the bleeds it leads thing. And I think the one thing that Trump is obviously horrible in so many different ways, but his brilliance is his understanding of what will drive a news cycle, and he knows it intuitively. And I think by the time you got to the 2020 election, he knew, especially with the bully pulpit of the presidency, he really understood that he could, just how much control he had over that news cycle and how valuable his antics are to the news. And so I think that he felt empowered. I think, to your point, Sean, I really do think that he felt empowered over the course of since 2015 and all the way through his presidency, to basically say, yeah, you know what, I can get away with. He knew what he could get away with because he knew that how much the media needed him. And that's a really unhealthy relationship between any person in the media, but certainly between the president of the United States and certainly between the president of the United States, who is Donald Trump, and the media. That is a recipe for where we are. It's a recipe for January fucking 6th is what it is.
Yeah, just a disaster. I mean, I just cringed every time that question came up. And it's like, who are you kidding here? Like, this is America. This is the United States of America. We're 240-year-old democracy. Like, how can you be asking this guy if he's going to concede? He'll get dragged out of the White House, and as a matter of fact, he almost had to be. So, right. Well, wow. That's like, we're almost at an hour, and that went by really quickly. And Doug, I want to give you the floor. Is there anything else that you would like to say about this problem of both sidesism or anything at all before we go?
Yeah, plug your stuff too. Plug your stuff.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, I think it was Sean, you mentioned earlier, was media telling us what we needed to know. How'd that go again?
Oh, telling people what they want to hear versus what they need to hear. Right. Because sometimes if it's COVID or whatever, or if it's the economy, you might need to hear some bad news.
Right. That's right.
Right. And it reminded me about the time that Reagan was elected. The economy was tanked and people were hurting. Suffering was going on, real suffering. And he went to the news media. And this is I don't have the quote. I don't have the source or anything. But this was, he talked to the presidents of the news medias at the time and said, look, people are suffering, people are hurting. Let's not put it on the news every single night. because every single night, this factory closed, this soup kitchen open, every night, because he knew that seeing it in the media drove opinion.
Right.
If you kept seeing the bad stuff, you'd be like, man, stuff sucks, and he didn't want that. So he asked them to, tone it down, and they did.
Which is crazy. That's
which
crazy.
Is crazy.
He shouldn't have that kind of power.
Right.
No.
And see, and then that allowed him then to say, see, things are getting better because it's in the media, and ever since then, it's been this access thing with the national media and the White House or the Congress that they don't want to say anything bad about them because then they won't come on their pundit shows, which I think should be banned. I hate pundit shows. I don't watch them.
They're the worst.
They are. And they've seeped into the NFL now. And I don't watch.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
I don't watch the pregame shows for the NFL anymore because of that. Anyway, and so ever since that time, and that was about the time the Fairness Doctrine went away, that these news media people have been taking dictation from Washington about what people need to know. And it's hurt us. It really has, because we need to see, even though it hurts us to see the negative stuff, we need to see that. And so when I was doing some research for talking to you guys today, it also reminded me about Geraldo Rivera. He's a mainstay on Fox. Most people think that he got his start with the Al Capone's Vault TV show, which I watched. I watched the whole 2 hours.
I watched it too.
And so people think that that's where he got his start, but he worked for WABC TV in New York, and he was hired in 1970 as a reporter. And in 1972, he broke open the case about the abuse that was going on at Willowbrook Hospital or something like that. It's where they kept mentally disabled people. And he snuck in with a camera crew and filmed the deplorable conditions that these people were being housed in. It was on Staten Island, Willowbrook State School, and Rockland County's Letchworth Village. And he won national awards for breaking that story. He was an investigative reporter that broke that story that ended up leading him to getting hired at 2020 on ABC. And that also led to a change in national policy to where they closed down all these warehouses that were warehousing mentally disabled people. And now people are getting better treatment in the community. Some people, though, still complain that people with mental disabilities, mental health disabilities, are falling through the cracks. But, some of that I watched. I think I was too young for the original report, but I think I saw it on YouTube. And it was just horrific, that the condition that these people were living in. And then to see him on Fox.
It's such a fall from a heroic investigative reporter to now this just muckraking asshole at Fox. And you know who else was really bad? You know what else took really personally was Brit Hume.
Yeah, that was another one. That's a great point.
I liked him until he turned into evil Brit Hume.
He really did. One thing that you mentioned, and I know we're closing down here, but I just want to just jump in here real quick and we talked a lot about today, you guys, both of you guys specifically talking about we need to hear the bad news, right? And you guys remember the Brave New World and the book. And so one of the things, Soma, was this drug that they would take, right? That basically what would just just sort of chill them out and make them not think about things that anything that was controversial or anything like that. And that's what I see on social media all the time, right? Like, why do you have to be divisive, right? Like, why are you pointing out this stuff? And just love everybody. Let's just love everybody as if that, right? This sort of stuff, ignoring it. And I think that one way that I see this sort of really playing out is with the masks, the COVID-19, right? COVID-19 is the first time in a long time that people have had any serious inconvenience in their lives, like, right? Where they really can't do exactly what they want to do whenever they want to do it, no matter how much money they have, right? Mm-hmm. It's not about money or whatever. It's like, no, you just can't get to X, Y, and Z place. And so what we're seeing is that same sort of temper tantrum of having to face reality, not being able to just put blinkers on and pretend that things aren't happening, that life is just great for everybody. And you see this temper tantrum. And I think it's so critical that we break through that temper tantrum somehow and get that truth to people, right? And we can perhaps live in a world that's a tad better. And we have a long way to go. But I'm really glad, Doug, that folks like you and what we're doing here, that we are doing our best, our little drop in the bucket to try and spread the word about this stuff. And I'm so glad that you came on, Doug.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I'm really glad to be here. And I really like your show and everything that you guys have on your website and everything. So it's really good. Awesome. Really good.
Yeah, well, again, we're really happy to have you. And thank you for being a Patreon supporter for us. That's awesome. And I look forward to also, like, maybe we can have, some more conversations surrounding media. I did not realize that you were a journalist. So that's like, this is awesome.
Well, I didn't get a degree, but I studied it. So
okay. Well, hey, you're better than 90%.
I know how it works.
Yeah. 90% of the people out there who call themselves reporters, I guarantee you're better than they are.
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly right.
Okay, well, thanks again, Doug. You have a great week, and until we talk to you again.
Thanks. You too.
Well, I really enjoyed that conversation with Doug and Christophe. Joe and Drew, what did you think?
Well, I thought that was an excellent discussion. I thought Mr. Berger had some excellent points. I mean, he took the words right out of my mouth in some cases. I stopped watching CNN during the 2016 election, not because I have any animosity or think they're fake news or any bullshit like that, but because I couldn't take that false equivalency, and those panel discussions would devolve into madness because they keep trying to indulge this false narrative that every single opinion and every idea is equally valid and deserves equal airtime, when that could not be further from the truth, as we learned during the Trump era. So I appreciated him coming on, and hopefully he'll join the show again.
Yeah. It was. I learned a lot from listening. It was an interesting conversation you guys had. I'm glad you invited him on. I think he made some very astute points about where we're at, right? Where what our strategy should be and what our problems are and how we should up our game, essentially.
Absolutely. And we want to do more of that, of course. We want to have good people on. I used to, on my solo show that I did many years ago, I used to have a lot of famous authors on, and I don't think that is quite the fit for our show, but I think having academics and experts is good. Like, we have someone lined up who I keep talking about, who has written an alternative constitution, and on October 1st, we're going to tape that show, you and I, Joe. And
I'm looking forward to that.
Me too. So yeah, we just keep hammering.
Yep.
Guys, we keep hammering, and that's what we do. So thank you for being with us today. That is our show. And if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Sean Prophet. Thank you for being here, and remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
The Radical Secular podcast is written and produced by Christophe Defoe, Sean Prophet, Joe Okipinti, and Drew Scott. Artwork and design by Tim Stetner. Post-production and theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.